Crime and Justice at the Policy Exchanges with us. Good to see you.
Good morning.
What did your report find?
So it's a pretty significant report with 26 recommendations. The big point that we found is that the way that protests are being policed and the legal regime is at huge odds from the mood of the public. So the public want to see more action by the police, and they would support more action by the police at protests. But particularly that what we're seeing is that members of the public are staying away from places like London and other cities when there are protests going on. So we found that well over 2/3 or just over 2/3 of people say that they wouldn't come in to go to a restaurant, they wouldn't go shopping, they would, particularly if they had young people, children, or elderly or disabled people with them, they would avoid coming into London. Of course,
reasonable.
And of course, a city like London, which is so dependent on tourism, this is a significant finding, we think.
Yeah. In what situations does the public support police intervention in disruptive protests?
A huge range. And here we were looking at measures of 85% of the public saying they would support intervention. So that might be disrupting the road, so sitting down on the road and preventing traffic from being able to move, the presence of racist or derogatory slogans, shouting, people being intimidating and shouting at passers-by. All of these sorts of things, a huge range of things. They're actually less supportive of intervention, where it is just a peaceful, quiet protest, that sort of situation, the public are actually pretty tolerant of. But where you have shouting, very large numbers and derogatory slogans, that's where the public want to see intervention.
And what about the swift sentencing of protesters, as we've seen over the last few weeks? Does that have much support?
Well, certainly, we don't cover that in terms of the polling, but certainly the conversations that we've had, there's huge support for that. And certainly our view, and we cover this in the report, is that the police action, very robust, and the swift sentencing should absolutely be supported.
Okay, and when you're talking about peaceful protest, what does that include? What would when we've seen the pro-Palestinian protests, for example, what category does that fall into?
Well, of course, I can't speak for every single protester,
no, of course.
But where we see people chanting slogans that are derogatory, where we've heard, certainly in the first 6 months, 400 arrests being taken place, a number of them, 15 of them, for terrorist offences. It's very difficult to see that shouting for jihad in the street, it is impossible, in fact, to see those things as peaceful protests.
What about two-tier policing? We're hearing a lot about that at the moment. It certainly upset the Commissioner recently.
Well, the point that we make about two-tier or differential policing, as we term it, is that the big problem is there's just a lack of transparency here. It's very difficult to say whether there's a systemic sort of two-tier or differential approach by the police. And the reason for that is they're so secretive in terms of who advises them, what advice they're getting. And the answer to that is more transparency, so we can really see what's at work here.
What do you want the government to take away from this report?
Well, as you say, there's 26 recommendations, so it's a big report, and it's supported by a couple of former Home Office ministers, a couple of Ministry of Justice ministers, Labour and Conservative, and a former Commissioner of the Met Police. They're about to do a big review of protest and public order legislation. And I think what we need to see is that some of the recommendations we make about the thresholds for police intervention, they really need to take attention of.
Am I right, on a personal level, you were a police officer previously?
I was,
okay.
Yeah.
What's it like when you find yourself facing the sort of challenges that we saw for some of our police officers over the summer?
I mean, it's incredibly challenging, and I can't not be here and comment on the remarkable courage of police officers on the front line. It's very, very difficult. The one thing that you know is that you've got colleagues with you, you've got your back, and that really makes all the difference in every policing situation. One of the things that we've seen in more recent years, of course, is every single policing situation, from the smallest to the biggest that we saw this summer, it's filmed on video. And I don't just mean one person, 10, 20, 30 people at a scene of something, filming something, and that can be quite difficult, knowing that you might end up on Sky News next morning for just doing your job normally.
Okay, it's good to see you. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks for telling us about the report. Much appreciated.